The topic for this episode is managing personal transitions. My expert guest is Devin Martin. Based in New York, Devin is one of the world's best transition coaches, and he specializes in taking high-performing people through major life transitions and decision making in that context. Devin, welcome. Let's just jump straight into it. When someone walks into your office for the first time, what do you typically see from them?
There's a range. I mean, obviously, if they're hiring a coach, something in their life feels like it's either missing or out of alignment. Oftentimes, people feel like something's wrong. Very, very rarely, people feel like everything's right and they want more. Um, but most often, what I'm seeing is people who have achieved enough success to realize that no more success is going to make them happy. And so they're trying to figure out what comes next. Often there's a story they've been telling themselves about their lives that if they, got some title, some zero or comma on their net worth, some recognition from other people, essentially, that then they would feel fulfilled, happy, good enough, or sometimes just able to relax. And they've usually come to me when they've realized that that's a myth. That's not working out for them. And so what I'm often helping people do is turn inward. These people have to a large degree solved for the outside world's problems. They can put a roof over their head, they can put food in their children's mouths, they may even be able to retire. But now they're on an inner journey. So you could call that an emotional journey, a spiritual journey, a relational journey, self-actualization, self-transformation, self-transcendence even.
One of the things that I've come to suspect but not be sure about, but there is sort of this vaguely midlife maturational stage when people hit that point of material comfort, as you talked about, but then there's something else that they're supposed to be transitioning into. And that is I don't think really a part of our culture at all. So people feel this very uncomfortable dissonance, but it's accompanied with a lot of shame as to the fact that they shouldn't be unhappy because they have enough. Is that something that you run into a lot?
Yeah. And it's something I dealt with from a young age. I wasn't born wealthy, but relatively speaking, I had great parents. We had a stable home. You could look at me and say, okay, he does well in school. He could have a good career. He's got enough things going for him. And I was miserable. And I went through an existential crisis, probably starting, I would say, honestly, sixth grade. Things started to feel a little off. And by the time I was finishing up high school, I was in a full blown, mental health crisis, really lost on an inward journey looking for meaning in life. Um, and so it's always made sense to me. Like, and I felt like I couldn't talk to people about it because most people I knew had more problems than I did. Most people had parents who weren't as understanding and loving as I was, or homes that weren't as stable financially. Maybe they didn't, school wasn't as easy for them, or, sports were easy enough for me. And so I kept it in, I didn't want to run around complaining because who the hell am I when my life's going well to complain about not being happy? Um, and so that makes perfect sense to me. And I think, unfortunately, most people don't recognize that it's an inner journey. And so they keep looking for the external markers. They just deny they say, I must be wrong. I'm crazy to think that I should be happy now. I haven't done that much. Maybe I should do more.
You've said the word inner journey twice now.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you?
I mean, introspection is an infinite process. I think for a lot of my clients, they're stuck in their head. So they're hyper rational, what we and Mr. McGilchrist would call left brained. And so to me, the journey out of the left brain goes in two directions. One is into the body, which is emotions. And so that's an inner journey, just getting in touch with how you personally feel about things. And then the other direction is, into the heart, or what I might call intuition or creativity or spirituality even. And so I think for a lot of people, that's another confusing thing is like, how do I be more than just rational? Am I supposed to be irrational? And I think part of the answer is yes, but you're also supposed to be transrational. And so trying to figure that out, most people want to go beyond their thoughts, but first they may have to slow down and just get back in touch with their personal preferences.
Actually, on that personal preferences idea, I worked with you, 7 years ago. And when I walked in, I couldn't even connect to what brought me alive. When people said to me, you need to be more creative, you need to connect with your flow, I had been on a professional treadmill for such a long time, I didn't really know what that was. And when someone said, you need to be more creative, what's that? Does that mean finger painting? Does that mean improv? Like, what does that actually mean? And how do I know that it's intrinsically mine when I can't connect with myself?
Yeah, I've come to see discipline as a form of self-denial. And with pretty much everything, if you talk to me long enough, you'll find out that I'm obsessed with the middle way. You can always have too much and too little. So we want to not throw it away, but we want to dial it in. So the world's most successful people tend to be hyper disciplined. And what that means is that they have some far off goal and they're really good at sacrificing their momentary pleasure or their personal preferences to get to that goal. And so if you don't want to wake up at 5 a.m., you do it anyways. And if you don't want to go to the gym, you go and you push harder because you don't want to be fucking lazy. And if you don't really enjoy your work, then you just keep going. And so if you've aligned yourself with a goal that is truly aligned with your heart, if your soul or your higher self or your true self picks a goal, then sometimes it's really helpful to just shut up and get the work done. You're not going to have a good day every day at work, and that's great. But if your goals are society's goals, if they exist in your head based on shoulds, what you think other people will respect, what you think other people will love, what you think other people will pay you for, now you're not doing your highest aim is not your own aim, and you're denying moment to moment what you prefer. And so I get these people who are stunningly brilliant. I mean, top of their field, could probably do anything they want. And I say, okay, you could retire. What do you want to do with your time? And they just go blank. There's not a hobby. There aren't a lot of personal relationships that are deeply fulfilling. There's no spiritual journey. There's no creativity. And what they've done is all these things have atrophied in their life. And so they've end up kind of this narrow human being and totally disconnected. And it's just like you. They're like, well, yeah, what am I going to do? Finger paint? Like, what does that have to do with me? And I'm like, sometimes, yeah, like maybe go dance, maybe get crazy, maybe just try a million things. But we need to like rekindle that inner flame that every little child has.
Having had these conversations now for the best part of 10 years, the default response from everyone, particularly if they have a family, is what about my kids? That you've hit peak earning years, quote unquote. You have mortgage, you have college. If you're not in that financially secure situation, how do you fulfill personal self-determination when you have so many responsibilities? How do you deal with that conversation?
I mean, to be honest, none of my clients are struggling to feed their children. They may be struggling to keep their children in the top private schools while also taking private flights to go on vacation. But I think their kids would be better off with a parent who's thriving than with a top tier education and a second home. And so that's what makes the biggest difference to me. Like, are you being a role model for your children? Are they witnessing a great example of what it's like to be an adult? Or are you sacrificing your own humanity and showing them that as an example and showing them that this is how they should live? So are you convincing them to be so disciplined that they lose touch with their own inner joy?
Yeah.
In which case, like, yeah, maybe you should downsize.
I've never heard any more impactful quote than the one from Carl Jung, which is, "There's no greater burden a child can bear than the unlived life of the parent."
Mm.
It's something that's deeply resonant for the people that I speak to. But as you said right up top, it's a balance, right? There's a middle way here. Um, One of the things you've really helped me with is offering a framework for the idea of conscious development of consciousness and the work of Ken Wilber. Just wondering if you could like discuss a little bit why you found that framework so helpful, and particularly for anyone else looking at their personal transition, how should they use that framework to assess where they are and what they can be doing next?
Yeah, so I was a hyper rational young kid, super into math, really easy for me. That was how my brain worked and naturally. Everything wanted to be quantified and linear. And I was raised fourth generation atheist, so like think Russians, Russian Jews. And so I had no room for spirituality in my life, but I had a deep spiritual impulse. I didn't know what to call it, but I wanted to ask ultimate questions. I wanted to explore the nature of reality and the nature of mind. And then I did psychedelics and my everything blew up. And, I realized the emptiness of math and language and concepts. And my mind was just a mess. And finding, some people refer to Ken Wilber as a philosopher, some call him a map maker. And I think the map maker label is appropriate. He really takes the broadest perspective I'm aware of reality and says, okay, let's assume that no human being is capable of 100% error. That means everybody has part of the truth. Now we just, but also everybody is partially wrong. So now we need a way of determining what is their perspective honoring and what is it missing. And so he's come up with Aqua as his primary framework, which is quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types. These are different ways of different perspectives to take on reality. And so the main thing that he accomplishes for me in the beginning is he finds a way for science and spirituality to play nice. And essentially, what everyone's doing is confusing objective reality, which is things you can see with a camera, for example, you can measure, you can quantify, with subjective reality, which is what's going on inside your mind. So the brain, you can measure EEG, you can measure blood flow and electricity and neurotransmitters eventually. Those all correlate with states of consciousness. You could say happy, sad, you could say waking, dreaming, deep sleep, you could say, enlightenment. You can't reduce one to the other ever. That is what I think where our society has gone horribly wrong. Essentially, we used to be irrational, pre-scientific, and we were just trusting, magical beliefs and mythic beliefs that weren't grounded in objective reality. And we had the Great Enlightenment, and we separated church and state, and we realized that there may be a spiritual reality, but there's this other thing called science, and we can measure it and quantify it, and we can all agree that we share a reality. And that was a massive leap forward. But Ken's famous for saying that when we separated church and state, we separated power and wisdom. And anytime something's fused, you want to differentiate it, but you don't want to leave it there because it can become dissociative. You then want to reintegrate it. And so when you're born, you're a baby, you're fused with reality. You don't know you're separate. And then you realize, oh, I'm not my mother. I'm not this toy. Your ego develops. You become narcissistic in a very healthy way. You're differentiated. But then you want to start to integrate into society and realize how you fit in. And that goes through many developmental stages, which is another element of his model. So there's states of consciousness, and then there's stages of consciousness. You can access a state of consciousness at any time. Waking, dreaming, and deep sleep correlate with meditative states, with, the path of enlightenment, with gross, subtle, and causal energy. And then you can get into witnessing and non-dual. But all of that is going to be interpreted through your stage of development. So human beings are born at the beginning, and then they start to become magical, and then they may develop into be a mythical. And people estimate 60%, 70% of humanity on the planet is still at a mythical level. So the Bible is true word for word. Magical basically means I am God. My thoughts control reality. It's like voodoo dolls, right? Mythical is there's another God, and if I appease him, then things will happen on my behalf. So I pray to that God. And then we start to become rational, and we start to realize, oh, like we're all sharing an objective reality. And maybe, it's not so magical. There's no like great being that controls everything. There's just laws, and they're factual. And then what America is seeing right now is this step into the postmodern, where we start to reintegrate the subjective. The rational level is purely objective. And we kind of, it's famous. Scientists say, don't trust your senses. They lie to you, trust the measurements. And so we all start to deny our inner experience. And this is the left brain path, right? We become hyper objectifying. Everything's cold and dead to us. Nothing's alive anymore. And in the postmodern, we start to realize like, oh, everybody has a unique perspective, and that's valid. And this is how we start getting, all of this crazy DEI, gender fluidity stuff. And essentially, like, they're still going either or thinking. It's either objective or it's subjective. And the next stage after postmodern is integral. And they call it a leap into second tier. And this is the first stage where we can say all the previous stages are true but partial. And they're all part of me. I have grown through them, and I still have them within me. There's still some magical thinking within me. There's still some myths is still really important. That's how culture works. I totally want to know scientifically how things work, but I don't want to be bound by it. There's got to be some room for metaphysics because we can't understand everything with physics yet. And my perspective is unique and it's valid. That's the postmodern. But also, I'm developing. And so the integral level is the first level that appreciates a developmental perspective. And so as somebody who was raised atheist and just thought everybody who believed in the church was idiots, all of a sudden I'm like, wait, that's like being mad at a 5-year-old for being young. Like what I want to do is honor where they are, see the beauty in it, and recognize that they're on a journey that we're all on. And if anything, I want to help them get to the next level, which is not my level. It's modern. If people are mythic, they need to start to understand reason. And we don't want to take them to postmodern or to integral yet. And so he puts together all of these frameworks that just make it easier to see where your own perspective is limited and how to take a bigger perspective. And as you grow through these different states and stages, the biggest thing that happens is you start to love more people. You include more living beings in your embrace. So you go from egocentric to ethnocentric to world centric. That means I care for all of humanity. And then I can care for all living human beings. I can care for the planet, and you start to see life in everything. And you start to realize it actually becomes spiritual at some point. You start to feel connected or one with all living things, and maybe even seeing all things as full of life.
Mhm. I used to have a real problem with these kind of hierarchies of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think I understood them, but also because they're often used as a way for people to say that they're more enlightened or more spiritual than you. But I think I've come to understand is that to exactly your point, they're talking about how integrated you are. And then that is about how much you can look at things with love. And I had a realization last week that maybe it's not particularly profound, but is if you look at someone or something with love, your understanding of it actually gets more complex. That
Yes.
if I think that you're some horrible narcissist and I have a very two-dimensional view of you, if I suddenly try and look at you through the lens of love, I have to try and consider what made you that way. And I have to immediately take a much, much richer view of you. And that struck me that that was analogous to people at these kind of different developmental levels. That you're not getting more superior to other people, you're just getting more nuanced in your understanding of them.
Yeah, and it gets very technical, but essentially, as you go through these stages of development, what's coming online is your capacity to take perspectives. And so they will go from first person perspective, which is narcissistic, to second person perspective, which is like, I recognize that you have a perspective, to third person perspective, which is, modernity, science. Like we can both look at something and see that from a third person perspective. Postmodern gets into a fourth person perspective, and it even gets into fifth and sixth. And it's probably not worth going down that rabbit hole now. But the other distinction he makes is between two types of hierarchy. And so the postmodern, or what they might call the green level, hates ranking. They're obsessed with power and oppression and victims and all these things. And they view all hierarchies as dominator hierarchies, where I'm above you, I have power over you. But they forget, or they're not aware of the fact that there is another type of hierarchy, which is in all of nature, which is a growth hierarchy. So like atoms to molecules to cells, they transcend and include each other. Or letters to words to sentences to paragraphs to chapters. That's another growth hierarchy. Like you can't skip stages. You have to understand the base level to go to the next level. And you can't throw away the lower levels or oppress them without doing harm to yourself. Like if I destroyed all my atoms, I don't exist. It's like chopping out the bottom rungs of the ladder as you climb it. And so when you start to see hierarchy that way, there's a lot of love in it. It's not I'm using this to stand above you and judge you and oppress you. It is we're all on a journey and we're growing. And what is the next stage of embrace to include more within me?
Yeah, I mean, that raises a great point. One of the major mistakes I made in executing my own personal transition was effectively that I'd got a relatively highly cultivated skill set that I acquired on Wall Street, which was the ability to analyze, to summarize, to detect insights. And then in my transition to something that was quote unquote more spiritual, or what I thought was more spiritual, I completely discarded that skill set. So what I did was is I cut off a part of myself. And when I deal with people in transition now, I'm like, no, you have to work out how to place that thing in service of something that means more to you, that you find meaningful. And that transition is still unbelievably difficult, but it brings you back together in a way that's more holistic. Is that something you've run into or something you've seen as people go through this process?
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear with stage development. We tend to reject the stage we're growing out of, and it's healthy. It's part of really embracing the next stage. And so as we're transitioning, let's say if we're totally wrapped up in the church and we have a mythic belief system, and I had some really good friends who were Mormon, and they discovered Ken Wilber, and they started getting into this more rational, and they went very quick into later stages. But the first thing they did was completely radically reject myth. And it's awful, it's evil, it's stupid. I can't believe I believed in that. And there's some shame in there, right? And they go too far, but it's fine because we overcorrect and then it's like a pendulum, it swings back. And people who are coming out, if you look at the universities right now, these are people who are growing out of the rational level, out of modernity and going into post-modernity, and they're totally rejecting science as you and I would call science, and they're basically saying like my perspective is the only thing that matters, and you can't oppress me with your science. And actually when people go into integral, even though it is the first stage that's supposed to honor all the stages, they still tend to reject green or postmodern. And so they'll really have an allergy to that, and that's fine. And so I think everybody, it's the same thing when I see somebody break up with someone. The first question I ask when they meet someone new, I say, is it a rebound? And they say, well, how do I know if it's a rebound? I say, well, take the top 2 or 3 things that most pissed you off about your ex. I bet you those 2 or 3 things are solved for. Now take all the things that were right about your ex that you've totally forgotten about. I bet you those are missing. And they go, oh shit, you're right. Like he couldn't make money. I got somebody who makes money now, but my ex was really nice and this guy's not nice. Or, it's something like that. And so I think we all have these like rebound relationships within ourselves.
That is brilliant. So let's take it down to tools. One of the many things I really like about you is you're relatively tool agnostic. That a lot of people in transitions or therapy, they get wedded to one modality as the one ring to rule them all sort of thing. But when someone walks into your office, you have a framework that I think is really powerful, incorporating Ken Wilber, but you also have a toolbox. Like, what do you recommend to people, and how do you think about that?
It's funny. At this point, I study obsessively and I try to make it all intuitive. And so the goal is to have a lot of things on tap, but not to show up with a prejudice, no prejudgment of what's going to be appropriate. And so it really depends, if somebody wants to go deep, then you keep dragging them down deeper layers within their own consciousness. Some people just want functional exercises, things they can do. And the fact that I want to go deep is not helpful to them. Some people want to talk about spirituality. Some people want to talk about purpose. Some people want to talk about relationships. And so at this point, it's been, I've been 15 years doing this. I try to be as blank as possible. I try to like keep studying, keep testing myself. I have lists of core concepts and core exercises that every year I would make a list. What are the things I seem to be using? Are they helping? Are they not helping? But when I look at the people I work with, there's a handful of things that if you want to hear, I could tell you like what seems to be really helpful for almost everybody.
I gotta hear that. Yeah. Lay it on me. Yeah.
So almost everybody realizes that they should be or thinks they should be meditating more. And if you're a hyperachiever, especially if you have ADHD or, you're just restless type A, it's the hardest thing in the world. I love getting people doing breathing exercises. I think breathing exercises is the golden path towards so many things. People, if you want to do meditation, if you want to do psychedelics, start with your breath. And for a lot of people, they had never figured out how to have a proper relationship with their mind or with their nervous system. And so we have basically you have all the things in your body that happen without your consciousness, so your heart beats, your stomach digests, all these things happen. You can't control them. Your breath is the one kind of thing in the middle. Like you can move your arms, you can blink your eyes. Your breath is this thing that happens automatically, but you can take control of it. And when you do take control of it, everything else moves in sync with it. So your heart rate will change, your digestion will change, your thoughts will change. So rather than using the brain to try to slow the brain down and have no thoughts and like be in a meditatively blank state, work with your breath. And I could give you, if you did a 40-minute breathing exercise at the Art of Living or at this place called Frequency that does holotropic breath work in New York, at the end of that, you're going to be in a meditative state. You're going to notice the tone of your thoughts has shifted. You're going to notice the speed of your thoughts has shifted. Your awareness might be more somatic and less linguistic. You're going to be having more pleasure in your body probably. And so, for a lot of people who are revving hyper alert, they're more sympathetic than parasympathetic. We want to start to figure out how that's happening. And there's postures, I'll get people focused on their physical posture, but also their facial posture. If you scrunch your forehead and clench your jaw, it changes the tone of your thinking. Like you can't feel anxious without breathing short, shallow, and quick. And you can't feel anxious without holding your inhale in. So every time you inhale, your heart goes a little bit faster. Every time you exhale, it goes a little bit slower. It's very, very subtle, but that's heart rate variability. That's you going sympathetic, parasympathetic, sympathetic, parasympathetic. So what happens when you get anxious? Most people go, they breathe in and they don't fully exhale. And then if you come over and give them a hug and just hold on for like 30 seconds, they'll go, and their shoulders will drop. And now they're like giving themselves permission to relax. And so why not just learn how to do that? And so I've been practicing breath work for, I don't know, 25 years. And I've learned that I can raise my energy, I can lower my energy, I can speed up my thoughts, I can slow down my thoughts. You know, everybody seems to agree that holding your breath in is related to anxiety. It's my theory. I haven't, it's maybe there's been science, I haven't read it, that as somebody who's prone to depression, I think I hold my breath out. So I will not breathe in enough. So I'll be overly parasympathetic, overly slow and grounded. And so that it sounds ridiculous to a lot of people because everybody breathes all day long to say like, maybe you're not doing it well and maybe it'd be worth practicing, but that has a huge impact. I get a lot of people doing gratitude journals, especially hyper intellectual executives of big companies, people who have a lot of things going on in their life and think they need more and have a hard time recognizing just how much is going well. I have a very specific format, which if you do it long enough, I think installs, it's kind of, I think of it kind of like installing a subroutine in your brain that is scanning the environment, looking for things that are already going well. And so I have people name one thing about themselves, one thing about another person, and one random thing they noticed in the environment. And I say, buy a journal, put it on your pillow. That way you can't go to bed without picking it up. So you can't say you forgot. It takes 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. You have enough time always. Write down those 3 things and try to actually like connect with your heart and feel the gratitude. And if you really want like an A+, wake up in the morning and look at them again. And so what you're doing is you're trying to control the last thought in your head at night and the first thought in your head in the morning. When I was super depressive, I realized that I would wake up dark and I was going to bed dark. And so why not seed your unconsciousness with the thoughts you want to have? And there's a lot of ways of using visualization to do this, but gratitude is just so beneficial. And most people struggle in one of those 3 areas pretty quickly. And I don't think it changes you until you really get to the end of your list. You're not allowed to repeat the same thing. So every day you got to find a new thing about yourself that you have gratitude for, a new thing about somebody else, and a new random thing you notice in the world. And at some point you run out of things. And then what happens is unconsciously you're walking around in the world and your brain is scanning the environment going, oh shit, I need something to say tonight. What can I notice that I have gratitude about? And what that feels like is like, oh, I kind of like my life. Things are going well today. Like the train will show up on time and you'll be happy about it.
I love that. But to reflect on this, like when I was professionally very unhappy, I got very into meditation of the very worst kind, which was like thought control. And
Mm.
it was terrible for me. And I think it was terribly badly executed because I was kind of doing it on my own. But I remember something you said to me that I'll remember my whole life, which is, you have a nail in your foot. You can meditate the pain away, but you just might need to take the nail out of your foot. There's a lot of this situation where I feel in midlife, if you have coping mechanisms, the coping mechanisms start to fail because you're not supposed to be coping, you're supposed to be moving. And one
Yes.
of your specialties is taking big decisions. So I appreciate it's a broad question, but how do you know when you're in the position of like, oh my God, I actually need to change something in my life, or I need to just expand the list of things that I'm doing in order to make myself more holistically happy?
I think it's always both. So most people who have one big thing in their life are looking for the next big thing. And, I've spoken about it before, but I came up with the term, working with a lot of people in finance, I came up with the term emotional diversification because it's very obvious if you put all your money in one stock, you create a high anxiety situation. And if you spread it out in indexes or whatever, then your capital spread out and you're more stable. And so like in your life, you should have many things going on. You shouldn't only be emotionally caring about your work or just your work and your kids. You want to have hobbies and relationships and spirituality and inner work and all kinds of curiosities and things you're exploring. And so it's both and. Most people who are hyperachievers need to start diversifying. And then that actually ends up being how you figure out what else you want to do. And I think most people need to follow, a word we both love, curiosity. And for them, I often just get them starting to recognize how their energy works. So certain things give you energy. They make you excited. Other things are a drain on your energy and you have to be hyper disciplined to follow through on them. And so maybe you're trying a bunch of new relationships, a bunch of new activities, a bunch of new hobbies, and you're using this as a way to get in touch with yourself. I don't really care if you pick the right thing. I care if you learn while you're doing it, you know? And then as you're doing that, it's going to change the way you feel about your work. you're either going to realize, there are parts of this that I love and I want to double down on those things. And there are parts that I hate and I'm going to start removing those things. And for some of my clients, it's really just refining the way they show up. I'm always telling people leadership is defined by what you don't do. So if you can give away enough work for 10,000 people, you're a great leader. If you're constantly holding on to things, then you're not a great leader. And so like the second you get an idea, how quickly can you inspire and empower other people to work on that with you? And so for a lot of people, it's figuring out like, what is your, Gay Hendricks has a book, The Big Leap, I love. And he talks about your zone of genius. And you figure out like, what is the one thing that you really come alive doing? This, and you're probably going to be uniquely gifted at it. And if you're not already, then you just need to do it more. And you're so energized and you see it so clearly and that you're going to keep getting better rapidly. And so the goal is to figure out, what is your zone of excellence? Which are the things you're fine at, but they don't make you come alive, and start getting those things out of your life. And then there are other things which just make you miserable, which you should remove from your life. And so we go through this process of really refining your understanding of what you want to do. And it's, we talk about this like radical self-indulgence, like what is great for you. And what you end up realizing is that is always a gift to the world. It is always a way of being of service. It doesn't feel good to rape, pillage, and plunder. It feels good to contribute. And it feels good to contribute in a way that is uniquely coming from you and your perspective. And so when people start doing that, it starts to become more and more clear. Should I make a massive leap, or should I just be subtly tweaking my role and taking on new responsibilities or new projects? And then sometimes people just have to say no. Like for me personally, this has been a theme in my life. When I can't see the path forward, I have to start cutting things out that aren't working. And so just removing relationships, removing jobs, removing myself from a location, and creating, I say emptiness is a vacuum that sucks clarity in. And sometimes you have to hold space in your life. If you're just somebody who can't help but be busy every second of every day, then we need to figure out how to slow you down. And so like I took a sabbatical for a year. That's the extreme version. Some people, I'm getting to take a weekend off because they haven't really disconnected from their job in 10 years, And so it's usually a process of learning how to turn inward, pay attention to yourself, and then change your level of responsibility at work so you can try new things.
Yeah, it's wild for me how this approach seems to have worked for you because, complexity science has this basic, rather complex frame where it's like differentiation plus integration equals, the place where what only you can do meets what the world needs. And that gets wrapped up in all these awful words like service and sacrifice, which have these very religious overtones. But you mentioned this phrase of yours, which I think is dynamite, which is radical self-indulgence, which I think, like a bit like Joseph Campbell's Follow Your Bliss, it gets singularly misunderstood because when people hear self-indulgence, they think ice cream. And
Right.
could you maybe talk around that a little more?
Yeah, I think there's shallow self-indulgence and then there's deep or radical self-indulgence. And so, cocaine and hookers may feel good for 5 minutes. Most people are not happy with themselves in the morning. There's a level of disconnection required from parts of yourself. Yes, you're probably dehumanizing other people as well, but we don't even have to go there. There are parts of yourself that are suffering when you're doing that. That's, dissociative. And so if you're deeply self-indulgent, I think you're paying attention to what feels good. It's not momentary mouth pleasure, you know, it's like, okay, I just ate a pound of chocolate. How do I feel right now? Well, actually, I feel sick, and I kind of want to eat some fruit or some protein, And so, like, if you go through actually introspecting and noticing how your actions impact you, it tends to draw you down this path of what I consider to be self-indulgence in the deepest sense of what is helping me feel more alive, more connected, more valuable, more. And yes, it does end up being of service. Like, I don't know a single person whose purpose in life is not somehow connected to something greater than themselves. You may be born to take care of your kids. You may be born to contribute to science and new understandings. You may be born to do a million things, but nobody, I think, wants to be alone. What's the worst thing you can do to a prisoner? You put him in solitary confinement. You take him away from other criminals, right? We are born to be connected. And so if you pay attention to how your actions impact the world around you, you find these positive feedback loops. You find ways to show up where your gifts are received. I mean, that's why they're called gifts, right? You have things that you can do that you're uniquely great at, or just uniquely inspired by. I think curiosity is a great leading indicator. You know, there are certain things that for some reason they hold your attention. And so if you keep doing those things, you know, magic happens. You know, people talk about synchronicities and it sounds like a dirty word, but I'm just saying be in sync with your environment. When you're in sync, there are synchronicities. There's nothing magical about it. Like I was thinking the other day about surfing. Like if you've ever tried surfing against the waves, you know what it's like to be out of sync. And then you turn around and you paddle with the waves and you just get in sync with the ocean. And all of a sudden, the whole ocean is contributing to the direction you want to move in. And it feels like the universe is showing up to support you. You're in sync with the universe. And like, I think that's what synchronicities are like.
Yeah, if I could kind of condense my entire worldview into like two clauses, it would be that hidden forces exist and aligning with those hidden forces makes your life go better. Like it's really simple stuff, but it does fly in the face of our current materialist paradigm that you live in a dead box. I think one,
And human beings are exquisitely sensitive to things that we can't rationally understand. And so you have to, you know, it feels like faith. It feels like surrender. It feels like letting go. But what you're doing is recognizing that you're in this unbelievably highly evolved body, which is sensitive to all kinds of energy and information that your left brain can't, you know, quantify yet. But if you trust the energy moving through you, emotions, energy, and motion, however you want to think of it, and just follow that, your bliss, then you are actually stepping into sync with the universe.
I think the major problem about everything that we're talking about is that a lack of examples. That again, it's very easy for us to point to people who are objectively successful, but when you're looking at people who've rediscovered this flow, they're often indistinguishable because what's happening to them is so inner, it's so interior. Given you have probably one of the most robust data sets on the planet of people that you've taken through these transitions, what does it look like to get to the other side, and why is this even worth it?
Yeah, it's funny. I have a client who once said to me, he goes, Devin, you wouldn't believe how different I am now than I was a year ago. And I said, what do you mean? How so? And he said, I can sit still.
Hmm.
And I was like, wow. I mean, I know this, you know, this guy is a hyperachiever. He's just incredibly productive. And I said, tell me more. And he said, Devin, when people talk, I can listen and I'm curious about them and I want to know about them. And every other moment of his life was trying to prove something, trying to accomplish something, trying to be significant. And all of a sudden there was this like, you know, he was still a very, very active person, very successful, but there was this like center to him that you couldn't knock him off center the same way. And he could just kind of relax and be himself. And he trusted that his being himself was enough. And so there's this like depth of self-love and confidence that I think starts to blossom when you trust that your natural impulses are healthy. You know, another thing I love to say is that spontaneity is a hallmark of mental health, you know? And so I think people confuse, there's a pre-trans fallacy here as well. Before you're disciplined, you're impulsive, and that's not great. You know, it's this momentary mouth pleasure, you know. And then we learn like, oh, I can't be naked in public. I can't have sex with every beautiful woman. I can't get in fist fights all the time. I can't just shove cake in my mouth all day long. And so we start to become disciplined. And when you're young, discipline comes from outside of you. And so it feels like oppression. And a lot of us have a rebellious attitude against being disciplined. But I once started studying the word and I found it was linked to disciple. And I started thinking of discipline as to be a disciple unto yourself. And so now you can really get in tune with yourself and say, this is my highest goal. And I want to use my ability to corral myself in one direction to move towards that. And as you start to trust yourself and as you get on this path of actually doing things you deeply believe in, the discipline starts to melt away and you realize that your natural urges are leading you in the right direction. And so that's spontaneity. That is, there's something bubbling up energetically. You know, we could follow it through the chakra systems, like from your genitals to your belly to your heart to your throat. You want to speak, you know, it's connecting with your mind. And as that energy moves up, you can do one of two things. You can either judge it and say, I don't know, this is probably not appropriate. I tend to do things that are inappropriate. I shouldn't trust myself. Let me run this through a rational filter. And, you know, it feels like an autoimmune condition to me. It's like part of your energy wants to move forward and part of your energy is pulling back. And so now you're living this life of shoulds. I should do this. I shouldn't do that. Other people will like me for this. They won't like me for that. And I'm only going to do what I think other people, you know, and now you're in other people's heads and you're in this stuck in comparison. And then when you throw off those shackles, what happens is like you get an idea and you speak out loud and you don't even know what you're saying. You haven't judged it. I don't know what the hell I'm saying right now. I haven't thought about this, and written it down. I'm not reading a script. And so I talk about people having like presence over preparation. Can we really get to a place where you're deeply present and you're trusting what's arising spontaneously from you? Like you and I have spent our whole entire lives preparing for this moment right now. Like we can take notes and we can have an agenda, but nothing we could do to prepare would compare to living our whole entire life to get right here. So I would much rather just have you surprise me with a question and see what the hell I say and have both of us be surprised than trying to like control myself. And I think that is also following your bliss. That is also being in sync with reality, is just trusting that my body and my mind are way more complex than my tiny little sliver of conscious thought could ever comprehend.
I worry that this observation is going to be tainted by the severity of my own experience, but I
Mm.
have this sense that the transition from being kind of left hemisphere ego oriented to being right hemisphere kind of surrendering to the flow, to use a really annoying sentence, um, that has to often necessitate a big death and rebirth, like a pretty cataclysmic change in your life pattern. At least it did for me. But like, is that right based on what you've seen? Like, how much of this has to be this transition to a mystery school where your life completely changes and you burn everything down? And how much of it is people just making incremental changes at the margin? Again, like, what have you seen across this huge data set?
I mean, I think it depends on how much you've been living in denial, you know. And so if you really are out of touch with yourself and you're working in an industry that you really don't believe in at all, and actually maybe you hate it, and you're maybe morally you're opposed to it, then it's going to be hard, and maybe all your relationships are rooted in things that you don't even agree with. You don't want anything to do with it, you know. But I think the truth is everyone else around you is probably doing something similar. And so if you can connect with the common humanity in everybody, it's not like you have to reject everyone and throw everything away. There are other ways to connect. And so, there's no rules. Um, I found my life experience was pretty tumultuous when I went through my major life transitions that we talked about previously in the written interview. Um, but I had terrible mentorship. I didn't have great examples. I was not good at asking for help. I didn't know where to go to seek help. Um, I think things like Leading Edge are trying to make this smoother. And I think if we're surrounded by a community, I mean, one of the things we've lost is community around major life transitions. Like I wasn't given a rite of passage. I had no, I was offered a bar mitzvah, but that's a joke to me for transitioning into adulthoods. I think a lot of young men need an existential crisis to grapple with so they can start to take, responsibility for their own life. And so I had to turn my life upside down to get that. I had to drop out of school. I had to do psychedelics. I had to, really just leave the educational system and take control of the information that enters my mind and the values I assign for it. And I felt completely unmoored. Had I elders who held me in some ritual and offered me wisdom, I think it could have been much smoother. And I hope as a coach, and a writer, I hope that's what I'm offering to other people is the recognition that what they're going through is healthy. I felt like, oh, humanity's all going in one direction. I don't believe in that direction. I don't belong with humanity. I have nowhere I belong.
You've mentioned psychedelics a couple of times, and I kind of get the heebie-jeebies a little bit with this being presented as too easy a fix. And you've written some great stuff and talked very cogently about psychedelics, showing you the work, not doing the work for you. As the interest and usage explodes, and maybe people get curious about trying it within a legal framework, like how do you think about that?
Ken Wilber's been very helpful here as well. One of the things he says is we want to experience peak states, but then the challenge is turning them into altered traits.
Huh, great.
And so you experience massive neuroplasticity on psychedelics. Like the research is great now. We really can see what the brain's doing much more clearly. And we used to think it was happening during the experience. Recent research has shown that there's many weeks after the experience where you still have neuroplasticity. And so then the question is, what are you doing in that time? And what I point out to people is if you go back to all of the same rituals, behaviors, routines, relationships, conversations, your brain settles back into the old grooves. Not much changes. You get this wonderful experience and some afterglow, and then you kind of go back to the way you were, but maybe you feel worse because now you know there's something else possible. And so for a lot of people, there's a period of that. They pop out of it and they think, oh God, I got to do drugs again because I lost the thread. And they'll keep going back. And there's nothing wrong with going back necessarily, but I think integration afterwards is the vast majority of the work. And so you've been shown another way of being. What are you going to do about it? You know, and so like daily practices, you know, getting up, turning inward before turning outward. So this is one of my, you know, maybe you can't go on sabbatical for a year. Can you keep your phone off for the first hour you're awake and do something introspective? Can you pay attention to your body, your mind, your emotions, anything that's not coming from outside of you? You know, can you have, call it a spiritual practice, call it journaling, call it meditation for stress reduction? I don't care. It's all going to kind of lead you in the same direction. But what are you actually willing to change in your life? You know, people, we used to believe that personality was fixed. Like if you do research, most people say your personality is what it is. It doesn't change very much throughout your entire life. Maybe there's a couple of things that show late in life, a couple, like if you look at the big five personality matrix, a couple of things can change late in life. But what I believe is that most people's personalities don't change because their circumstances don't change. And, you know, it kind of goes back to you are the average of the five people you associate with most, but it's also the TV shows you watch, you know, the job you work, the house you live in, the position you sleep in. And so if you're willing to change, then you have, if you want to change, then you have to actually start changing those things. And, you know, I think inner change and outer change have to move in lockstep. So if you want to change your consciousness, you have to change your behavior. And if you want to change your behavior, you have to change your consciousness. So psychedelics can give you a radically new perspective on your life and make it shockingly clear how different every moment can feel. But if you don't do anything differently, you're going to go right back to who you were.
Yeah, and the other thing that, you know, you talked about the big five, and, you know, one of the things that psychedelics can reliably change is your openness.
Yes.
Often so open that your brain falls out.
Yeah.
The basically you come out and suddenly you become much more into conspirituality, and you don't know what to adopt. And one of the many things I like about you is you seem to have excellent discernment when it comes to knowing, you know, what's actually useful and what isn't. Like, how do you think about that as you see people on the other side of these journeys?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of this is, again, it's that kind of like allergy we have to something we've grown out of. And so if we believe whatever it is, we believe the government is trustworthy, or we believe corporations are trustworthy. And all of a sudden we realize sometimes they're not. We start to see that everywhere. And we have this like pattern recognition thing we do. We install new cognitive biases, you know, new mental models. And the problem is we're still stuck in a model. We're not doing first principles thinking. You know, like we've realized there's conspiracy. People who have recognized one conspiracy rapidly recognize multiple conspiracies. And it has nothing to do with whether they're true or not. It's just this thing we do where we like, oh, this is how the world works. And now we have a new way the world works. And so, you know, we need to start doing some thinking for yourself. I mean, that's my main thing. What do I know? How do I know it? You know, and for me, it's always, what are the multiple perspectives? There is no one true perspective. Like, I think if you have one true perspective and now you're throwing that away and taking another true perspective, you're missing it. You know, like if I'm reading the news, I want to know, what is the right saying? What is the left saying? What is the center saying? What are the scientists saying? What are the spiritual people saying? And again, it's like everybody has part of the truth. Nobody has the whole truth. I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The fact that there has been some corruption in government doesn't mean everybody in government is bad. You know, I think most people are doing the best they can with the tools they have, you know, but also most people tend to focus too far away from themselves. I'm mostly focused on my own life, the things that I know firsthand and the things that I can impact firsthand. And so all of this can lead you to being radically dissociated from your own personal life. Like if you think the whole world is run by the Illuminati, what are you going to do about it? Have you met them? Are they your friends? Can you talk to them about their policies? If not, you probably shouldn't spend a ton of time thinking about it.
Yeah, and that's something that I found incredibly helpful, which is that you have to understand that the easiest place to start is with yourself, even though that can often be the hardest thing to change. And that the moment you get concerned with systemic changes and making systemic changes, you can get outside of your locus of control really, really quickly.
Yeah.
I think I spoke to John Bavecki recently, and he talks about the fact that you need a community. So something that I felt compelled to start. But you also need an ecology of practices, that you need a set of mutually reinforcing overlapping practices. So I always talk about the fact that I have Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that's deep embodiment and flow, but comes with injury risk. So I like to DJ, I like to get massages. When I write to dance music so that it puts me in flow, but also I'm only ever writing about stuff that I care about. So it's meaningful flow. So I have this sort of self-reinforcing ecology that has taken me a really long time to find. It's taken me 3 or 4 years to find. And actually my career now fits into that ecology as
Mm.
well. So that for me is I tell people like try and optimize for process in your life where you can get a process that you can sustain on a daily basis that you will enjoy intrinsically, because that will do a lot to reduce your anxiety about what your eventual destination is. So even when there's a lot of flux in your life, if you can bring your time horizon forward and then put your locus of control around yourself, that deals with a lot of paranoia and a lot of anxiety. Like, does any of that resonate with you?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of people think if they get into meditation too far, into spirituality too far, they're going to sit alone in a room and meditate and be happy and just disconnect from reality. And I think the opposite is true. I mean, yes, the world has had monks who, go off onto the mountain. I've gone off to the mountain for a year. But I think what actually happens is when you see more clearly, you make less of a mess and you spiral out from your center with more love, care, compassion, connection, and understanding. And so I do think, yeah, the locus of control is a great term. Like you don't want to get too far away from it. There are certain people who spend all their time deep down internet rabbit holes, and none of it is anything they have any impact on. I'm just not interested in who you're going to vote for president. You're going to do it once every 4 years. I mean, I'm mildly curious, but if that's what you're spending most of your time thinking about it, like you're not actually taking part. That is not where you can have an impact. Like how are your friends? How are you? And I think if you're not okay, you can't help other people. You're distorting things when you interact with them. You don't have to be perfect, but you have to be at least trying to recognize, like, I just assume I have biases and prejudices and I'm misunderstanding people all the time. And I'm trying to do better. But I also know that, like, if I got a bad night's sleep, I'm a bit of an asshole, and I need to, like, slow down, take care of myself, and not run around seeing devils everywhere. And so I think it's incredibly important to focus on yourself. And then, yes, like start to take part in concentric circles that maybe occasionally you start to have a global impact, but it's not where most of your thoughts should be.
I've worked for less time than you, but probably 4 years with people who sought me out and the similar profile, high achievers in transition. And I would say often the hardest thing to get them to realize is not what you would expect, which is that one, they have gifts, and two, that those will be valued in the world. And that seems to be based around self-love, which is this unbelievably annoying phrase that I never really knew how to contextualize except later through action. And again, like this ability to see things through a lens of love. But one of the things I really worry about is that most of these introspective tools, the way we use them, particularly things like therapy and psychiatry, are like scalpels that they use to dissect yourself, and that can be like a really unpleasant exercise. So aside from the gratitude journaling, is the stuff that you found that really brings out that self-love?
One of the biggest things I have people do is just notice the way you're talking to yourself. Our inner dialogues get vicious. People are not, I find the more high achieving somebody is, often the less kind they are with themselves. And often they believe that that's how they motivate. That's part of the discipline, is like, don't be lazy, don't be weak, don't slow down, do more. And I do think it comes back to self-love. Almost nobody was raised in a home with perfect unconditional love. There were conditions placed on love. You got praised for doing one thing and you got punished for doing another thing. And that's appropriate to a certain degree. We want to be conditioned so we can fit into society. But most parents, were in a bad mood sometimes, or they were raised to judge certain things as wrong, which are fine. And so, or, they had bad moments emotionally and we learned how to take care of them by hiding part of ourself. And so most of us have parts of ourselves that we don't believe are lovable. And we learn to hide them or alter them or change them. And but one of the ways we do that, these are like the introjections or the voices. People are into parts work right now, internal family systems. And so there's there are these parts of us that manage other parts of us, and it gets quite violent inside. And so I'll have people just write down, like, how are you talking to yourself? And sometimes I'll just say, okay, let's just flip the script. Let's just do the opposite. And this is going to feel ridiculous. Like when I was really depressed, I was just telling myself that my life was shit and the world was going to shit and everybody was stupid and, all of these horrible judgmental things. And so I would wake up every morning and I would make myself smile in the mirror because studies showed that was as effective as Prozac. And I didn't want to take Prozac. And then I would say things like, I had this like song, I can't remember the lyrics, but it was basically like every day in every way, things are getting better and better and better. And my life is improving and I have great people around me. The only way I knew it was working was if there was this voice in my head that said, "You fucking idiot. This is so stupid. I can't believe you're doing this." And I would just tear myself apart and I'd be like, aha, my ego or my monkey mind or whatever you want to call it, it's fighting back because it thinks that believing the opposite of this is what is going to lead me to a successful life. Because probably at some point in my life that was working, but it's not working anymore. And so I have to piss that part of me off. And I know that as like somebody who's hyper intellectual, I have to be like super positive and faith-based and happy-go-lucky. Because I'm good at being irritable and sarcastic. I'm not good at being joyful. And so I just have to fake it. And so I would like bounce up and down and smile and sing and like act like, a fool in my mind. But I was reprogramming myself. I was going against the voices in my head and rewriting them.
As part of my litany of mistakes in my own transition, one of the things I tried to do was silence that voice in my head, and I actually succeeded in what I think was killing my ego for a few days, and basically myself disappeared into nothingness, and it was absolutely terrifying, and it felt like a horrifying mistake. And now on the other side of it, I realized that that ego was agency, and it's this phenomenal tool. And the expression I like to say is that if you have a hunting dog and you don't give it a job, it's going to tear your apartment apart. If you don't walk your beagle 6 times a day, it's going to eat your shoes. And so now I do have an inner monologue, but it's exceptionally compassionate because I've given it a job that it really enjoys. It's this idea of like you have this really sharpened toolbox, but it has to be doing something you both believe in. And even the IFS stuff that I've seen is sort of if you have a goal that gets the parts on side, everyone starts to work together. And I guess that
Yeah.
fits for you as well.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people have taken on this language of transcending the ego as if we want to get rid of it. And, if Ken Wilber's famous for saying over and over and over again, transcend and include, transcend and include. This is the thing where like, as you go to higher stages, you don't throw out the earlier stages. And actually, spirituality is not enough. You also have to do shadow work. And so there are parts of yourself that you've denied or cut out, and you want to actually build up your ego. You want to create a stronger, healthier ego. You know, Freud, everyone says, id and ego. And Freud was actually using it and I. He didn't use the words id and ego. The translator did that.
Hmm.
And so where it was, there I become. The things that I've dissociated from and put outside of myself, the shadow, the things I project, they become myself again. So you're actually building up your I. And then you can transcend that. But you want a healthy I when you transcend it, and you want to keep working on that.
Well, I know you and I quote Richard Rohr. Richard Rohr, the first half of life is about building a container, and the second half of life is working out what you're putting in it. I see a
Yeah.
lot of people start at quite a spiritual place very early on in their lives, and they have no executive function. That
Yes.
basically they don't have skills that they can then deploy in service of something, and they get equally embittered and reject the system, and that kind of doesn't get us anywhere. So. Probably the most heretical idea that I've ever had is this idea that once you find radical self-indulgence, once you find the sweet spot where what only you can do meets what the world needs, and you start to see those synchronicities, that effectively the universe holds you in a way that is very counter to our view of reality.
Yeah.
That it will support leaps into the unknown, that it will provide for you in some way. And that idea is so crazy. I'm not sure to the extent to which I believe it. Is there any kind of sense that you have as to whether that is true based on what you've seen in your career so far?
100%. Yeah. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is we are processing more information than we know how to appreciate. And it is just, stepping into the flow sounds esoteric, but it's like Can you feel the way the wind is blowing? Do you want to walk against the wind or do you want to walk with the wind? Now, what if there's a lot of other information flowing through the universe through you and you can sense it and you can get in sync with it and be aligned with it, or you can go against it? And so I think that words like surrender and faith come up because we don't know how to talk about trusting. You know, there are times when, like, I mean, it could be the dumbest thing. Like, my wife and I laugh about this. This happens all the time. I'll be like, okay, I need to take the day off. I need to reschedule 6 clients. And I'll reach out to 5 of them and I'll reschedule. And then one of them, I just don't want to send the email for some reason. And I'll just watch that. I'll be like, why don't I want to send this email? And then about a half an hour later, they'll reach out and say, hey, I need to cancel that day. And my wife goes, oh, again? And she just rolls her eyes, like, whatever, you know? And so, like, obviously I could be delusional. I could be making that up. You don't have to trust me. But in my life, there's a lot of things like that. There's just a lot of things where I feel like there is some information that maybe they told me something 5 weeks ago and my unconscious remembered it. And so I didn't reach out to them. Maybe there's morphogenetic resonance with some, non-local information. Maybe we're quantumly entangled. Like, all of this to me misses the point, which is that when I'm intuitive, there are things that want to happen through me. And I can either allow myself spontaneously to do those things and just be in alignment with myself, or I can grind my mental gears and try to plan and control. And, it's like we're all trying to think our way through. And like, what can you can have 6, 8 bits of information in your short-term memory. Do you want to be hyper focused on those 6 or 8 bits of information? Or do you want to let, like, the hard drive, which has all the information, or maybe the cloud, which has even more information, do the processing, and then allow that if you can shut off the conscious thinking mind, things bubble up. We used to get ideas on the toilet or in the shower because we weren't staring at the phone, or you go for a walk in nature and ideas bubble up. And that's what I found in meditation, is that when I can stop staring at my thinking mind, it will get my attention when it wants it. And so I had this, for me, one of the most profound experiences in meditation was, this was many years ago. I was sitting, and all of a sudden it just became blindingly obvious to me that my brain was my sixth sense. And so I realized that while I'm in meditation, I almost never taste anything. But if I wanted to, I could focus on my tongue. And it's working. If there was hot sauce placed in my mouth, I would feel it. And my nose is always working, but we're really kind of pathetically, most human beings, disconnected from our sense of smell unless something drastic happens. And then I realized that my brain is thinking the whole entire time. It's just like, it's this fucking crazy person over here. And it's just like anxious and curious, and it's got ideas, and I can stare at it all day long and hyper focus on it and try to make sense of it, or I can just ignore it. And it's doing the same exact thing. And it's actually going way subtler than I've ever been able to experience. Because, at one point I realized all I could do was think in words, and I became obsessed with thinking without words. Like, what's going on? And there's music and there's emotions and there's all this subtle energy and abstract concepts, but it just keeps getting subtler and subtler and subtler and subtler. And so do I want to just like stare at the surface of the pool of water, or do I want to allow consciousness to be able to sink deep, 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 deep into all the deeper currents? And the only way that can happen for me is to not obsess over the short-term memory, the few things on your calendar you think you're supposed to be thinking about it. And it can feel like going radically blank. It can feel like just being present in the moment. But then you have these ahas or these insights or these impulses that you just want to follow and play with. And so the process for me of meditation and the spiritual journey is this journey from gross to subtle to causal, this journey from the big, heavy moving parts. Like, those words don't make sense to people, but if you work in engineering, like with anything mechanical, there will be one knob you can turn to adjust a machine, which is the gross adjustment. And so it's moving it in big chunks. And then there will be a fine knob, which is more subtle dial. So let's say like I move the first knob and I get it's moving hundredths. So I go 1, 2, 300. The second knob is going to do 10. So 310, 20, 30. Okay, 330. The next knob is doing ones, and then 0.1. And then maybe it's getting like down to the millions. And so like what I notice in meditation is that your consciousness becomes more refined. You notice slimmer slices of reality. It can become extraordinarily subtle. And that feels quieter,
I've never ever thought about it that way, but a penny has just dropped for me, and that's really
Mm.
helpful, because I believe the single greatest difference to my quality of life is something so insanely simple, which is assuming that the outside world is way smarter than I am, and
Hmm.
may even be continually offering me cues and feedback that are not just gross, that they're subtle, right? That you're constantly getting little nudges here and there that represent intelligent feedback as to the direction you should be taking with your life. Whether those are big, knock your socks off synchronicities, or whether they're just tiny little nudges from people, the receptiveness to that has been truly transformational for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And also what happens is you need less stimulation to feel pleasure and to feel connection.
Yeah.
And so it's the opposite of addiction. You know, if you take a small dose of heroin, the next time you need twice as much, 10 times as much, you know, sex, people start spiraling out into crazy sex parties with 100 partners doing BDSM. Humanity. Like we should be able to feel a subtle touch caress on our skin. We shouldn't need extreme sensation to feel anything. And what you do when you sit in meditation and you start to realize that your body is experience an overwhelming amount of sensation in every second. Like the great revelation of meditation for me is that happiness is not, or bliss or joy is not something you add to the moment. It's what was always already there when you strip away all the layers of distraction. At a very subtle level, you are blissed out right now, whether you know it or not. And
Yeah.
if you're just noticing the big chunks, like linguistic chunks, words are big, gross objects compared to how subtle your awareness can become, then you're missing out on the bliss of being in a body.
Right. And one of the things that you see across every spiritual tradition is love, and that love is subtle, love is constantly around, but love is also a very powerful guide. And your power actually scales with love. That the more loving you are, the more integral you are, to use Ken Wilber's expression. It is a subtle guide, it improves your relationships, and it is, I think, quite denigrated in today's world because we don't have any sophistication around our expression and sensing of it because it gets drowned out by so many other things.
Yeah, and romantic love is a gross form of love. It's a big chunky form of love. It's the obvious one that hits you over the head. But you can be in love with ideas. You can be in love with a million friends. You can be in love with the felt sense of being in your body. Like it does feel like the word eros, I find helpful. And it's like this, some people call it an erotic charge. It's related to that. It's this like you feel drawn to things. And in my experience, that is the part of the fundamental fabric of reality. But it's a very subtle, refined version of love. It's not this romantic thing like we want to have sex with everybody. You know, it's just feeling a sense of connection or caring or curiosity with everything.
Well, to go back to, my core view of there are hidden forces and you can align with them. Those hidden forces are called attractors. And where else are you going to feel attractors than your heart? How else are you going to feel them other than through love? It just may be a very fine-grained kind of love, but the more granularly you can express yourself and feel those emotions and feel those sensations, the more precisely you can guide yourself through quite a subtle environment.
Yeah.
So I think we're coming up to time. I'd like to leave everyone, rather than with like a podcast in the absolute, more how do we bring maybe an experiment and a commitment into our lives? Like
Mm.
if you've heard this and you're interested, what's something relatively light that you can do just to get a taste? And then what's a commitment, which is that like if you really want to take these ideas into your life and take them very seriously, what would you recommend people do?
I mean, what just popped into my head was some type of introspective experimentation. Uh, Start a journal where you keep track of whether things are increasing or decreasing your energy, and then commit to doing the things you usually do and something new. And just notice, do I feel more or less energized? There are, conversations you're like, yes, you run towards them. And there are conversations where you're like, ugh, I don't want to have them, and there are activities, there are exercises, there are a million things. And I think if you want to take it to the next level, you share this with somebody. You don't do this in isolation as a way of disconnecting. You bring this to other people and talk to them about it, and maybe inspire somebody else to do it with you. I do think this community aspect is huge. And I've noticed one of the hardest things people when people work with me, there's almost always this point where they've started to change, and then they think it's a problem because they recognize that everyone around them is not changing with them. And they start to go, oh my God, do I have to end all my relationships? Do I have to find all new relationships? And it's almost never the case. I mean, you probably do need to find new relationships because it's beautiful and it's wonderful. And you may need to spend less time with certain people, but life is often a game of leapfrog where you get ahead, they get ahead, and there's let's say a dozen lines of development. Maybe you're obsessing over one, maybe they're on a different line right now. But the problem is that you're not sharing your journey with them, really. They may be going through similar things. Chances are they are. And if you can open up and share what's happening for you. And so being more vulnerable, being more open makes everyone's life. It's a gift to other people when you can share your journey with them, especially when it's hard for you. And so I would say, yeah, commit to some experimentation, take note of how it's changing your energies. And then if you really want to do it, share it.
Yeah. To end with one of my favorite quotes, which is love is mutually accelerating disclosure. That basically,
Mm,
when you're in the early days of this relationship, you start telling your partner everything. But I think reality works the same way, in that the more open you make yourself in a loving way, the more you'll receive back from the environment, not just in terms of your relationships, but in terms of these subtle signals. But you have to start to make yourself open first, whether that's the experiment you put out into the world or some sort of quote unquote creative act.
yeah, I love that.
Devin Martin, this was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.